The morning the old goat died, the bugler could not finish reveille. I had heard Pell's sound that call 1100 times in 9 years, and not once had the note wavered. It is a hard, bright, climbing thing, that call, meant to pull tired men up out of their blankets and onto their feet before they have decided to be awake. But on that gray morning, halfway up the second phrase, the brass simply stopped, and the silence that fell over the barracks square of Holt Barracks was the loudest thing I have ever not heard. I was a corporal then, of the Carrow Fusiliers, the second oldest line regiment in the Kingdom of Varn, and I had pulled the dawn watch on the inner gate. From my post I could see the whole square at once, the long stone barrack blocks, the armory, the white-painted guardhouse, the worn parade ground where 10,000 men had learned to march and to stand. And I could see the small railed enclosure beside the forage store, with its little timber shelter, where for as long as anyone serving could remember, our mascot had spent his nights. Old Sergeant Maddox came across the square at a pace I had never seen him use. Maddox did not run. Maddox had not run, the saying went, since the day he was born, and he had walked out of that on principle. But he came across the cobbles fast and grim, and he stopped at the enclosure rail and took off his cap, and stood there with it in both hands, and I understood before anyone said a word. The mascot was a goat. I should say that plainly, because I have learned that when people hear it, they smile, and I do not blame them, and then I have to wait for the smiling to pass before they will believe the rest. His name on the regimental rolls was Sergeant Buckthorn IV, and he had been the Carrow Fusiliers' goat for 19 years, which is a very great age for a goat, far past what most of them are given. He had a coat the color of old ivory gone gray at the muzzle, one horn that curled true and one that had a notch in it from a gait he had argued with as a youngster, and a pair of dark, level, unbothered eyes that had watched more parades than most generals. He had a rank, and it was not a joke. He drew a ration. He had a keeper, a private soldier given the honor of it, and a polished collar with the regimental badge, and a coat of the regimental scarlet that he wore on ceremonial days, cut and tailored for him by the same firm that made the officers' tunics. On the great parades he walked at the head of the column, ahead of the colors, ahead of the band, ahead of the colonel himself, at a pace entirely his own, and the whole regiment took its step from his. And now he was gone in the night of nothing but his years, lying in the straw of his little shelter as though he had only laid his head down, which I suppose is exactly what he had done. I have stood guard through a great many mornings. I have stood through a state visit with the gates locked and 300 men at the wall, and through a riot pressing the railings, and through a night so cold the rifle froze to my glove. I tell you the truth, I have rarely seen a barracks square go as quiet as it went that gray morning over the death of an old goat, and I have thought about why in the years since, more than I have thought about almost anything else I saw in my service. By the time the sun had properly cleared the eastern block, the word had gone everywhere. Men came out of the barrack rooms half-dressed and stood about the enclosure, not speaking, not knowing what to do with their hands. Young Tobias Wren, who was Buckthorn's keeper, the private soldier whose whole duty it was to feed and groom and walk the goat, sat down on the cobbles by the rail and put his face in his hands, and not one man among us thought the worse of him for it. He was 19. He had had the keeping of the old goat for 2 years, which is to say he had had the best billet in the regiment, and he knew it, and now he sat on the stones and his shoulders shook. Sergeant Maddox put his cap back on and turned and looked at the men gathering, and I watched him decide something. I have served under hard men and soft men and a great many in between, and Maddox was the kind who was hard in exactly the way a wall is hard. You could lean your whole weight on him and he would not give, and that was a comfort, not a cruelty. "Wren," he said, not unkindly, "on your feet, son." Tobias got up. His face was a wreck. "You'll not leave him lying in the straw," Maddox said. "He's a soldier of this regiment. We don't leave our soldiers lying in the straw. Go and fetch clean bedding and the green blanket from the stores, the good one, and we'll lay him out proper until the colonel says what's to be done. And that was the first of it. That was the small thing, the first small decision from which everything else came. We did not leave him lying in the straw. The whole of what followed grew out of those few words, the way a great tree grows out of a thing you could hold in your palm. I will tell you about the colonel, because the colonel mattered. Colonel Aldous Severn had commanded the Carrow Fusiliers for 6 years. He was not a sentimental man, or did not appear to be one, which in my experience is not always the same thing. He was lean and exact, with gray at the temples and a way of looking at you that made you account for yourself before he had said a word. He had buried men. He had written the letters that go home with a regiment's grief folded inside them, and he had written a great many of them, and the men knew it, and that knowledge was the bedrock under everything he ordered. They sent for him, and he came down from the officers' mess across the square, and the men opened to let him through to the rail. He stood looking down at the old goat in the straw for a long moment, and his face did not change, but I was near enough to see his jaw, and his jaw was not the jaw of a man who finds the matter amusing. 19 years, he said at last, to no one in particular. 19 years come Michaelmas, sir, said Maddox. The colonel nodded slowly. He was here before me. He was here before most of you. He looked up and ran his eye over the men ringing the enclosure, the half-dressed privates and the corporals and the cooks who had come out with flour still on their hands. He was here before that boy was born, he said, with a small movement of his head toward Tobias, and that boy has wept for him and not one of you is laughing. He let that sit. Why is that, do you suppose? No one answered. It was not the sort of question a private answers to a colonel. Because he was ours, the colonel said. Because a regiment is not its stones and it is not its rifles. A regiment is a thing that is handed down, and he was handed down to us the way the colors are handed down, the way the silver is handed down, the way the names on the wall in the chapel are handed down. He is the only soldier among us who served under 4 colonels and never once put a foot wrong on parade. A flicker, then, at the corner of his mouth, not quite a smile, the ghost of one. Which is more than I can say for the rest of you. That earned a sound from the men, half a laugh and half a sob, the kind of sound a tired and grieving body of men makes when someone gives it permission to feel 2 things at once. Sergeant Maddox, the colonel said, and his voice changed, came up into the register men obey. Sir, Sergeant Buckthorne served this regiment with perfect discipline for 19 years. He will be buried with the honors of his rank. See to it. And he turned and walked back across the square, and we stood there, and somewhere in my chest something I had not expected loosened and ached. The honors of his rank. He had said it as though there were nothing strange in it at all, as though it were the most obvious order a colonel ever gave. I want to be honest with you, because if I am not honest you will not believe the end of it, and the end of it is the whole point. Not everyone thought it was right. The trouble when it came from above, the way trouble usually does. The Carrow Fusiliers did not exist in a vacuum. We answered to the district command, and the district command answered to the War Office in the capital, and the War Office was a building full of clerks and ledgers and men who had never in their lives taken a step from an old goat at the head of a column, and to whom, therefore, the whole business was going to look like exactly what it was not. It was a man named Undersecretary Harlan Price who heard of it first. Word of a regiment burying its mascot with full military honors traveled, as these things do, and it reached a desk in the capital before noon of the second day, and the desk did not care for it. I know what was in the letter because the colonel, in a fury he kept entirely off his face, read parts of it aloud to the senior men in the orderly room, and I was there carrying the morning returns. It has come to the attention of this office, the colonel read in a flat, careful voice, that the Carrow Fusiliers propose to render full military funeral honors, to include a firing party, the muffled drum, the reversed arms, and the lowering of the colors, to a regimental animal. He looked up. He has underlined animal, twice. He read on. While this office holds the traditions of the line regiments in the highest regard, it cannot countenance the expenditure of public solemnity and the time of serving soldiers upon what is, however affectionately regarded, livestock. You are directed to inter the animal quietly and without ceremony, and to return your men to their proper duties. The orderly room was very still. Livestock, said Maddox, as though the word were a stone he had bitten down on. The colonel folded the letter along its existing creases precisely, and set it on the desk, and squared it to the edge with one finger. I have noticed that the most disciplined men, when they are angry, become not louder but quieter, not faster but slower, as though anger were a horse they had a great deal of practice in riding. He is not wrong on the facts, the colonel said, surprising me. An old goat is on the facts an old goat. The War Office is a careful place, and careful places have to be careful, because if they are not, every regiment in the kingdom will bury its cat next, and its pet rook, and the day after that some fool of a colonel will want a 21-gun salute for a tortoise, and the whole coin of military honor will be spent down to nothing. He paused. Mr. Price is guarding something. I will give him that. He is guarding the meaning of the honors by being careful who gets them. That is not a contemptible thing to guard. He looked round at us. But he is wrong about which thing this is, he said, and I am going to tell him so, and then I am going to do exactly as I have ordered, because I am right, and because some things a man has to be willing to be wrong in the eyes of the careful in order to be right in front of his own. I did not understand then the whole of what he meant. I understood it 3 days later in the rain, with my rifle reversed and my chin on my chest, and I have understood it more deeply every year since. The colonel wrote his answer that same evening, and he did not write it in a fury, which is what made it dangerous. He wrote it the way you sharpen a blade, slowly, with patience, until the edge is so fine you do not feel it go in. He did not argue that the goat was a man. He was too clever for that and too honest. Instead he wrote, and I have the words near enough by heart because the regiment kept the letter and reads it still on the anniversary, that the honors of a military funeral are not rendered to the body in the box. They are rendered to the thing the body stood for. We do not lower the colors over a man, the colonel wrote, because his heart has stopped. Hearts stop everywhere, every hour, the world over, and the colors stay at the truck. We lower them because of what the man held up for the years his heart was beating. Sergeant Buckthorn held up 19 years of this regiment's continuity. He marched at the head of this column when the men who march in it now were not yet born, and he will be remembered by men not yet born who will march behind a goat who is not yet born, who will be the fourth's heir as the fourth was his sire's. He is the living thread of us. You ask me to bury our continuity quietly in a ditch by night, and tell the men to go back to their duties. Sir, the burying of him with honor is their duty. It is the oldest duty a regiment has to remember in front of the young, that they are part of something that does not die when a heart does. I will render the honors. If the office wishes to discipline me for it, the office knows my address. He sealed it and gave it to the rider himself, and I watched the rider go out the gate at a canter into the dusk, and I thought, with the certainty of the young, that we had just watched a good colonel end his career over a goat. I was wrong about that too, but it was 3 days before I learned how wrong, and in those 3 days the barracks did a thing I have never forgotten. We prepared. You must understand what a barracks is on an ordinary day. It is 10,000 small frictions. It is the cook who is short with the corporal, and the corporal who is short with the private, and the 2 companies that do not love each other, and the old hands who think the young ones are soft, and the young ones who think the old ones are finished. It is a hard, grinding, complaining, magnificent machine, and on an ordinary day it is held together by drill and by the fear of the sergeant and by nothing softer than that. For those 3 days the friction stopped. It began in the carpenter's shop. The pioneer sergeant, A great slab of a man named Croft, who had never to my knowledge said a tender word in his life, took it upon himself to build the coffin. He did not ask permission. He simply went into the timber store and took the seasoned oak that was being kept for the new mess tables, the good oak, the expensive oak, and he began to build. And when the quartermaster came to complain about the timber, Croft looked at him, and the quartermaster looked at the half-built coffin, and the quartermaster went away and came back an hour later with the brass fittings from his own private store, the ones he had been saving for he would not say what, and laid them on the bench without a word, and went away again. Croft worked 2 nights through. He inlaid the lid with the regimental crest in lighter wood, the crossed muskets and the buck's head that was our badge. For the regiment had carried a goat at its head for so long that the goat had got into the badge itself, generations back, and no man living knew which had come first, the beast or the badge. He carved it by lamplight with a chisel that had belonged to his father, and when he was done, it was the finest thing I have ever seen come out of that shop, and it was for a goat, and not one man laughed. The tailor's shop took Buckthorn's ceremonial coat, the scarlet one, and cleaned and pressed it and laid it ready, for the colonel had ordered that the old goat be buried in his uniform as any soldier is. The armorer's mate polished the badge on the collar until you could shave in it. The cooks, and this is the part I tell when I want a man to understand what a regiment is, the cooks, who had complained for 19 years about the goat getting into the kitchen garden and eating the regimental cabbages, the cooks baked. They baked because there would be men coming, they said, and you cannot have men coming and nothing to give them. And a wake is a wake whether it is for a sergeant of 40 years or a sergeant of 19, and they were not going to be shamed by an empty table. They did not say they were grieving. Cooks do not say things like that. They said the larder needed using up, and they baked enough to feed 3 regiments, and their eyes were red while they did it. Tobias Wren did not eat and did not sleep. He sat the watch over the body himself, would not be relieved, and we let him, because a keeper has the right. He had laid the old goat out on the green blanket in the cool of the forage store, on a bier the pioneers had knocked together, and he had brushed the gray ivory coat until it shone, and he had cleaned the curled horn and the notched horn, and he sat by the bier through 2 nights with a lantern, and I went and sat with him on the 2nd night because no man should sit a death watch entirely alone, not even for a goat, and especially not for a goat that 19 years of soldiers had loved. He knew his own name, Tobias said to me, in the small dark hours in the lantern light. He said it the way you say a thing you need a witness to. People think a goat doesn't, but he did. I'd come to the rail of a morning and say it Buckthorn, and his head would come up every time, no matter what he was at. 19 years he answered to it. He was quiet a while. He'll not answer to it now. I keep going to say it, and then I stop. I did not have anything to give him that was equal to that, so I gave him what I had, which was that I stayed, and we sat, and the lantern burned, and outside the whole barracks slept the light sleep of men who are going to have to be strong in the morning. I will tell you a thing I noticed in those 3 days, and it is the heart of why I have never been able to make this story sound smaller than it was. The men did not get foolish. That is what you might expect. That grief over an animal would make hard soldiers go soft and silly and sentimental, weeping and carrying on. It was the opposite. The men got better. The drill that week was the sharpest I ever saw it. The boots were the brightest. The salutes were the crispest. It was as though every man in the regiment, faced with a thing he did not have words for, reached for the only language he was sure of, the language of doing his soldiering perfectly, and spoke his grief in that. You cannot say, I loved that old goat and I do not know why and it has hurt me. You are a fusilier. You have no such words. But you can polish your brass until it burns, and bring your heels together so they ring, and stand so still and so true at the next parade that the man who taught you would weep to see it. And in that you have said the whole of it, and said it better than words could. That is discipline. People think discipline is the opposite of feeling. I have come to believe it is the truest container feeling has ever been given. The man who cannot feel does not need discipline. It is the man who feels everything who needs a wall to hold it and a shape to pour it into so that it does not drown him. We poured 19 years of love for an old gray goat into the shape of perfect soldiering, and it held, and it did not drown us. And on the third day the rider came back from the capital. He did not come back alone. He came back ahead of a carriage, and the carriage carried General Hester Vane, who commanded the whole district, and the district commanded us, and a general does not ride 2 days from the capital to settle the matter of a goat. So every man who saw the carriage come through the gate felt his stomach drop, because we all thought the same thing, that the careful place had decided to make an example, and that the example was going to be our colonel. The general was a small, upright, weathered woman with iron gray hair under her cap and eyes that missed nothing, and she had served 40 years and buried a husband who had served 40 years, and she was not a person you wanted to discover had come to break you. The colonel met her at the steps of the orderly room, and they went inside, and the door shut, and the whole barracks stood about the square pretending to be at its duties, and listening with every fiber for the sound of a career ending. I was on the gate again, so I did not hear it, but Maddox was inside having been called, and Maddox told us after, and I trust Maddox the way I trust the sunrise. The general, he said, had Price's first letter and the colonel's answer both laid on the desk in front of her. She read the colonel's answer through once more in front of him slowly, and then she looked up and she said, "Colonel Severn, do you know what this letter is?" "My resignation, if the office wishes to read it so, ma'am," the colonel said. "No," the general said. "It is the best statement of why we render honors that I have read in 40 years of service, and I have read a great many bad ones." She tapped it with one finger. "I have buried 200 men under my hand, Colonel. I have folded the colors, and I have heard the firing party, and I have handed the muffled drum to the drummer's boy, and somewhere in the 400th folding of it, a thing happens to a soldier that they will not warn you of at the start. The ritual goes smooth. It goes practiced. You can render full honors and feel nothing at all, and that is a kind of death too, the death of the meaning while the form goes on. The honors become a habit, a correct, empty habit." She paused. "And then a regiment proposes to bury a goat, and a careful man in a careful office is outraged, and the whole question of what the honors are for is suddenly, blessedly, alive again, argued over a desk, felt in the gut. Your old goat has done a thing no parade has done in this district in 20 years, Colonel. He has made us ask whether we still mean it." She stood. "I should think we had better find out that we do." And she told him she would render the honors with him. Herself, the district commander. She would stand the funeral of the Carrow Fusilier's goat, in her own person, in full review order, and she would dare any clerk in the kingdom to underline the word animal at her. That, Maddox said, was when the colonel, that exact, lean, unsentimental man, had to turn and look out of the window for a moment before he could thank her. And the general, being a person of perfect tact, spent that moment finding her gloves. Price's office sent one more letter. It was shorter. It noted stiffly that the district commander having assumed personal cognizance of the matter, the office considered it closed and would make no further representation. There was no apology in it. Careful places do not apologize. They fall silent, which from a careful place is the same thing. We pinned both his letters and the colonel's answer to the board in the mess, where they hang framed to this day. The outrage and the answer and the silence, the whole shape of the argument, so that the young men who come after will know it was not always easy, that the honors we render were once fought for, that nothing handed down stays handed down unless someone in every generation is willing to fight a careful man over a goat. But the thing none of us had reckoned on, not the colonel, not the general, not careful Mr. Price in his careful office, was the town. Holt Barracks sat at the edge of the market town of Holt, and the regiment and the town had lived alongside each other for 200 years, the way an old married couple does, grumbling and inseparable. The townsfolk knew the goat. Of course they knew the goat. On parade days he had walked the high street at the head of the column past the bakery and the saddler and the school, and the children had been lifted up to see him, and the bakery had, for 19 years, accidentally dropped a heel of bread by the curb at the exact spot the old goat passed, so that he might find it, and the regiment had pretended not to know, and the baker had pretended not to do it, and the goat had grown fat and dignified on 200 years of pretending. When the town heard that the Caro Fusilier's goat had died, and that the regiment was burying him with full honors, and that some office in the capital had tried to forbid it, and a general had ridden 2 days to overrule them, the town did not think it strange. The town thought it exactly right, and the town, without anyone organizing it, without a notice posted or a council called, began to come. They came first with flowers, left at the barrack gate, where I stood, so that I spent the day before the funeral receiving flowers from the people of Holt for a goat, and saluting them as I did, because what else was I to do? An old woman brought a single late rose from her garden and would not let me take it from her, but insisted on laying it herself at the foot of the gate pillar, and she said to me, "He used to take a carrot from my hand when I was a girl. Not this one. The one before. Buckthorn the third. But it is all the same goat, isn't it, in the end? It is all the same regiment." And she patted my arm as though I were the one who needed comforting, and walked away, and I have thought about what she said. It is all the same goat, more than once when I have not been able to sleep. The schoolmaster wrote to the colonel, and asked, with great diffidence, whether the children might be permitted to line the road. He thought it would teach them something he could not teach them from a book, what it is to honor a long faithfulness, what it is that a regiment is. The colonel wrote back 2 words, "They may." The bakery baked a fresh loaf and left it at the gate, the old curbside loaf, the last one, and there was no goat to find it now, and so I took it in. And I confess to you that a corporal of 9 years' hard service stood in the gatehouse of Holt Barracks holding a baker's loaf meant for a dead goat, and had to put it down and stand for a moment with his hand over his mouth until it passed. The newspapers heard. Of course the newspapers heard. By the eve of the funeral, the story of the old soldier goat and the office that tried to deny him his honors and the general who rode to give them had jumped from Holt to the district paper to the great papers of the capital, and a thing the careful office had tried to keep small and quiet and buried in a ditch by night had become, against everything that office intended, a matter the whole kingdom was talking about over its breakfast. I will tell you what it had become. It had become a question every reader was answering in their own heart, whether they knew it or not. Do we still believe that faithfulness should be honored? Does long service, given without complaint in a humble place by a humble creature, asking nothing, does it count for something or for nothing? And the kingdom, reading its breakfast papers, answered the way the town of Holt had answered, the way the general had answered, the way 19 years of grieving Fusiliers had answered. It answered. It counts. Of course it counts. What kind of people would we be if it did not? The night before the funeral, it began to rain. It rained all night, and it was raining still at dawn, a steady, gray, soaking rain, the kind that gets into the wool of a tunic and sits there cold against the skin and does not let up. And I will tell you that not one man, not one, suggested that the rain might be reason to make the thing smaller, to move it indoors, to hurry it. The opposite. A soldier knows that you measure what a thing is worth to you by what you are willing to suffer for it, and a regiment that would only bury its goat in the sunshine had not loved the goat at all. The rain, when it came, was almost a gift. It gave us a way to prove we meant it. We formed up on the square at the appointed hour in full review order, the whole regiment, 800 men, in our scarlet gone dark with the wet, the water running off the peaks of our caps and off the muzzles of our rifles. General Vane stood with the colonel at the saluting base, neither of them under cover, the rain on them the same as on the lowest private, and I have served 40 years since, and I have never respected two human beings more than I respected them standing bareheaded in that rain for the funeral of a goat. The pioneers bore the coffin. Croft's coffin, the good oak, the inlaid crest, the brass fittings, and it was small. Of course it was small. And the smallness of it was the thing that undid the watching crowd, because the crowd had come. The whole town had come, lining the square and the road beyond the gate, under a forest of black umbrellas. The schoolchildren in their rows with the schoolmaster, the baker, the old woman with no rose left to give, hundreds upon hundreds of the people of Holt standing in the rain. They had not quite known what they expected. And then the small coffin came out under the regimental flag draped over it, borne on the shoulders of 6 great pioneer soldiers who could have carried 10 times the weight, walking the slow march, the heel-to-toe parade funeral pace that takes a strong man's whole concentration not to break. And the band, Pell among them, the bugler who could not finish reveille, playing the slow march so soft and so low it was almost only the drum. The muffled drum. They had bound the drums in black cloth so that the beat came dead and soft, a heartbeat heard through a wall, and that sound did to the crowd what it has always done, what it was invented 10,000 funerals ago to do. It reached into the chest and laid a hand on the grief and said, "Here, you are allowed, this is the place for it." I heard the crowd begin to weep, not loudly, the way grown people weep when they are surprised by it. The schoolmaster had brought the children to be taught a thing he could not name, and the thing taught itself in the rain, through the muffled drum, and those children will be old men and women now, and I would wager every one of them remembers it. The grave had been dug in the corner of the square that the regiment kept for its own, for Buckthorn the third was there, and the second, and the first before living memory, a small railed plot with small weathered stones, the line of mascots stretching back 2 centuries into the regiment's beginning. They lowered the coffin on the lowering tapes, the colors dipped, and the colonel gave the order and the firing party. And yes, there was a firing party. The office had forbidden it by name and the general had granted it by name. The firing party brought their rifles up, and the volley cracked out 3 times across the wet square, sharp as breaking ice, and the rooks went up off the chapel roof in a black startled cloud. And that, the rooks going up at the volley, finished what the drum had begun. And there was not a dry face in the whole of Holt that was not already wet with the rain. Tobias Wren stood at the graveside as next of kin. The colonel had named him so, formally, on parade. Private Wren will stand as next of kin, having had the keeping of the deceased. And the boy stood there at 19 years old in the rain, white-faced, perfectly still, perfectly turned out, his grief poured entire into the shape of standing well. And when the volley had died and the bugler raised the wet bugle to play the last call over the grave, Pell did not falter this time. He had faltered at reveille, the call that wakes. He did not falter at the last post, the call that lays to rest. He played it true and clear and aching, every note of it, out over the bowed heads and the black umbrellas and the small grave and the long line of small stones. And when the last note climbed and held and faded into the rain, 800 men and a whole town stood in a silence you could have leaned your weight on. The general stepped to the grave. She looked down into it a moment. Then she came to attention, the old iron-gray woman with 40 years on her, and she saluted a slow, full, deliberate salute, held to a goat, to a soldier, to 19 years of faithfulness, to the thread of the thing that does not die when a heart does. And the whole regiment, on the colonel's command, came to the salute with her, 800 wet right hands, and held it, and across the rail and out into the road the people of Holt who had no drill to follow did the only thing they knew, and the men took off their hats and stood bareheaded in the rain. I have stood a great many salutes. I have saluted kings. I tell you without shame that the salute I am proudest of in 40 years of service is the one I held in the rain, with the water running down my sleeve, for the old gray goat of the Carrow Fusiliers, because it was the truest one. There was nothing in it to gain. He could not promote me. He could not even know. We saluted him for no reason on this earth except that he had been faithful, and that we had loved him, and that some faithfulness is so long and so quiet, and so complete, that it makes a claim on you that you are less of a man if you do not answer. That is what the careful office never understood, and what the general understood in a single reading, and what the old woman at the gate had understood her whole life, that the honors are not a reward you earn by being important. They are a thing the living do to keep themselves human. We did not lower the colors for the goat's sake. The goat was past all caring. We lowered them for hours, to stand in front of the young in the rain, and say with our bodies, "This regiment honors faithfulness. This regiment remembers. This regiment does not bury what it loves in a ditch by night and go quietly back to its duties as though nothing had been lost. We are part of something that does not die. That is the whole of it. That is what the small coffin under the flag taught a town full of weeping children, and what it has taught me every day since. There is a goat at the head of the Carrow Fusiliers still. Buckthorn the Fifth, a young one now, ivory-coated, 2 good horns, who answers to his name and walks his own pace at the head of the column and eats the baker's curbside loaf, and the children of Holt are lifted up to see him as their parents were, and their parents' parents. Tobias Wren rose to be the regimental sergeant major in time, a hard, fine soldier, and he kept the keeping of the goats as his own particular charge to the day he retired, and he taught every young keeper after him the one thing he said mattered. Say his name to him of a morning, every morning. He knows it, and one day you will go to say it and there will be no goat to answer, and you must be the kind of regiment that buries him properly when that day comes. The framed letters still hang in the mess. The careful man's outrage, the colonel's answer, the careful man's silence, and under them, added later, a small brass plate that the general had made and sent, and it says only this: "Here we render honors to faithfulness, wherever it is found, and in whatever humble body it has worn out its life, lest we forget what the honors are for." I am an old man now. I have outlived the colonel and the general both, and most of the men who stood that day. But every Michaelmas I go back to Holt, and I stand at the small railed plot with its line of small stones in the rain if it rains, and I take off my hat to an old gray goat who has been dead these 40 years, and I am not ashamed, and I am never alone there. There are always others. There are always somehow others. It is all the same goat, the old woman said. It is all the same regiment. She was right. She was more right than any office in the capital, and she has been right every year since, and she will be right long after I am laid in my own grave with the colors dipped over me and the muffled drum, and the last post climbing into whatever weather the day has brought. Some faithfulness is so quiet that the careful cannot see it, but the rest of us can. And as long as we are the kind of people who will stand bareheaded in the rain to honor it, in whatever humble body it has worn out its life, then we are still, I think, the kind of people worth the standing. I would do it again tomorrow. I would do it in worse rain. And so I have come to believe, would you?